All right, so this is lesson 2, globalization and identity, and we're looking at cultural homogenization, and we're going to use that term to help us do some skill development with A1 sources. This is an easy source to get us started. With any source, with any cartoon, a cartoon is usually a satire. So a satire means that the cartoonist is using what they believe to be humor to present a problem in society. And we should be able to look at elements within the source, so details within the drawing, to infer a solution that the cartoonist would accept. And from the solution, we might be able to see an audience that they're targeting. We might be able to, from that, see an ideological perspective. So with regards to this source, what's the problem that the cartoonist is alarmed about? So alarmed that he or she, I see the name, but I don't recognize it. He or she was so alarmed about, they said, you know what, I'm going to draw something. I have to draw something. I'm uncomfortable about this thing that's happening in the world, so I'm going to draw something down. So what's the problem that inspired the source? Yes?
I'm going to say McDonald's.
So McDonald's is definitely a big part of the problem, because we have Ronald McDonald, the iconic symbol of McDonald's, being the dominant figure in the source, and we have the golden arches at the bottom. So you're definitely right that McDonald's is a part of it. So is this source targeting McDonald's, the transnational corporation, and saying McDonald's is bad? Or is there another nuance to it? Is McDonald's being used as a personification to allow us to talk about something bigger? Yes?
I think it's talking about like North America, because it's such a big, like McDonald's is a big thing, and it's like definitely some overconsumption and stuff.
Okay, so the target could be perhaps North Americans who, obviously the United States, Chicago, Illinois, this is the birthplace of McDonald's. I believe it's Chicago. I hate it that I'm recording myself because I'm pretty sure now I'm wrong. So we'll just say the United States was the birthplace of McDonald's. And we know that to be true. So the target could be the United States and overconsumption there. What's the fear of this cartoonist? So we just talked about cultural homogenization. How does this fit to cultural homogenization? What's the fear of the cartoonist? If this, then what? If we create one global culture, what's going to happen? Because that's the problem that inspired the source. The source is inspired because the source fears that one global culture will lead to something. What's the something that it's going to lead to? Don't overthink it. Look at details within the source. Labeling within cartoons is important. So whenever there's words on the page, they're there for a reason. So what words do we have to play with? Yes? Destroying life. So the thing that they're alarmed about is that one global culture will lead to overconsumption, which will lead to the destruction of life. That's the problem that they're exposing. That cultural homogenization will lead to overconsumption, which will lead to the destruction of life. That's their ideological perspective. That's their vision. That cultural homogenization is bad because it leads to overconsumption. So one of the tools that we can use to dissect the nuances of a source is to add evidence to further the ideological perspective. So if the ideological perspective here is that cultural homogenization leads to overconsumption, what evidence could we research? What evidence could we suggest that would further that perspective? So once again, if the theory here is that cultural homogenization leads to overconsumption, how do we prove that? So what does overconsumption look like? You could measure it. How would you measure it? Yes. Yes.
Okay. Consuming the Earth's resources faster than we revitalize and sustain.
Because the thing that they're eating here is an apple, and on the apple it shows a map of the world, we can see that that's also a symbol of things like the finite resources of the earth. So one way to measure the overconsumption that is suggested to be a consequence of globalization is to look at our use of finite resources. How much oil do we have left? How much coal do we have left? What are we doing with the Amazon rainforest? What is the habitat destruction? And how is that connected to our consumption? What is and I said a term maybe yesterday, what is that term that is used to describe the impact on the earth of our economic choices?
Ecological.
Yeah, so what is our ecological footprint? So what is the cost of our lifestyle? What is the cost of our standard of living and quality of life? What is the cost to the planet, the ecological footprint? That's the boot mark on the planet. So today I'm going to consume lots of things because I'm a beast like that. You know, I eat 8,000 calories a day. Not really. I'd be a lot bigger, but let's pretend that I do. So there's a cost to that. You know, the 3 pounds of bacon I had for breakfast, there's a cost to that. You know, somewhere there's a pig that's a lot smaller now because of me. So the earth has a burden, ecological footprint, because of my lifestyle. That's what this cartoonist is saying, is that the United States is guilty of overconsumption, and the fear is that as more countries adopt American values, they too will overconsume. And if enough countries, enough people are overconsuming, the ultimate end result will be
Death.
Death of life, right? The death of birth, the destruction of life. So that's the ideological perspective. Another way to measure it, if you didn't want to just look at the macros and look at, you know, how much oil does a country use up after they adopt American values, you could look at it at a micro level. So a macro level is a nationwide level. A micro level is an individual level. Individually, you can look at caloric intake. How many calories are people eating? How many calories do they need to sustain themselves? And are they eating more than they need? That's overconsumption by definition. You can look at caloric intake. So we could have a chart. We could have a chart that looks at caloric intake of different countries. And as they adopt American values, does their caloric intake go up? So as we can see that there are some countries that are catching up to the United States. But there are still some countries that, in terms of caloric intake, their caloric intake may still be a fraction of the United States, but the fear is that so many as more countries like India that has nearly 1.5 billion people, as they consume at the rate of the United States, as they go from 2,300 calories per day to 3,770 per day, there will be a bigger burden on the planet. That the ecological footprint of India will become the ecological footprint per capita of the United States, and the planet cannot bear that burden. That's the message of this cartoon. That the United States is guilty of overconsumption, and that cultural homogenization means that other countries in this emerging global culture, they're adopting American values, and they too are overconsuming. And the fear is that it's going to lead to the death of birth, the destruction of life. They use the McDonald's symbol to get our attention, and so that we can see the origin of the problem. The origin is the United States and their fast food culture. So it's not by accident that it's McDonald's. McDonald's is guilty because they've created a culture where people are consuming somewhat irresponsibly, somewhat irrationally, that there's healthier choices. But you could argue that there's a targeted audience here. Maybe Americans look at this and they say, you know what, maybe we skip McDonald's today and we choose a healthier choice. The targeted audience could be other countries, and they could say, maybe we need to role model ourselves or find a role model other than the United States. But last thing we'll talk about with this cartoon is, how do we know it's biased? Like, there's got to be some people that look at this cartoon and say, no, this is garbage, this is biased. That there's evidence to suggest this is wrong. That they picked the wrong enemy here. So if a big linchpin of their argument is that the United States is guilty of overconsumption because of their fast food culture, and they trace that fast food culture back to McDonald's, how do we know that McDonald's isn't as guilty as this cartoon shows? Because you can go to McDonald's and order what?
Apples.
Apples. You can go to McDonald's and order apples. You can go to McDonald's and have milk. Now, I don't do that because that's not why I would go to McDonald's, but they have salads, they have healthy choices, they have a healthy menu. So there is an anti-McDonald's bias in this cartoon that is an oversimplification because it's ignoring that they have a healthy menu. And that McDonald's is not alone in the guilt of creating a fast food culture based on overconsumption. So let's look at the controversy surrounding homogenization. So now that we're 20 minutes into homogenization today, hopefully you're sitting there thinking, you know what, I think I know a little bit about homogenization. If you leave here knowing that one term today, hey, we did something. So let's look at the controversy surrounding homogenization and see both beneficial and negative consequences of globalization. Everything traces back to globalization, right? The interconnectedness, the hyper-connectedness of mankind. One of the consequences is creation of a global culture. But could this cultural homogenization be good? Could it be bad? Let's take a look at the following source and see if you can find various perspectives in response to the common question, can homogenization be positive? So let's bring up the source. Let's see if you can see positive and negative. Although the crusade towards global sameness has attracted many critics, we must acknowledge the many successes that have resulted. Questioning traditions is not always a bad thing. In Spain, the once celebrated cultural blood sport of bullfighting has been questioned, and in many places is now illegal. In India, outsiders question the ritual suicide called sati, and it is now also illegal. Due to better global communication and the resulting increase in global cooperation, we can expect to have similar victories against traditions like Iranian public executions, African female genital mutilation, Saudi Arabian practice of stoning criminals, and cannibalism in New Guinea that are threats to people today. So, cultural homogenization. What is evidence in here that it's bad? Is there anything listed here that says, you know what, cultural homogenization could be a bad thing? Yes?
It's taking traditions away?
Yeah, so it could be seen as a bad thing because cultural homogenization is a threat to tradition, and tradition is a key part of people's identity, their history. They're part of their great chain of being. So for an outside country to come in, an outside culture to come in and begin to change one's traditions, there seems to be some ethnocentrism there. There seems to be some kind of imperialism there. So we can definitely see how that part could be seen as the negative part of homogenization. Even words like global sameness. The language there, global sameness, leads us to think of a mundane existence, a boring existence because of globalization. Or the word crusade. Not everyone looks back at the Crusades with glory. A lot of people look back at the Crusades as, again, an ethnocentric or a Eurocentric practice, where one culture thought that they were superior to others. Now, what's some evidence here that homogenization is actually good? Yes?
Well, some of those are very dangerous and things that probably shouldn't be illegal anyway, so that would be it.
Yeah, so, I mean, cannibalism, female genital mutilation, public executions, these are all very bad things. Ritual suicides. So, often people believe that cultures should have the right to exist. But the uncomfortable thing is that sometimes cultures may have traditions that shouldn't exist anywhere on earth. Just because it's your cultural practice doesn't make it right. So maybe your culture believes in cannibalism, and maybe those being cannibalized even think that it's an honor to be eaten by the group. It doesn't make it right. That we do have something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that applies to all on the planet. So when the Europeans arrived and the Aztecs were killing thousands of people per week, in hindsight, there were parts of the Aztec culture that were inappropriate. In New Guinea, where they were practicing cannibalism. In Africa, where there's female genital mutilation. And that's still existing today. So the uncomfortable part of it is that sometimes homogenization can be what is human, necessary in 2020. Child brides. There are some cultures that children younger than 8 are being married into families. And there may be multiple brides. And they become mothers well younger than you are. Maybe children need to be able to be children. So here's a cartoon that has an agenda. I think you can tell me the agenda. Even if you can't read Spanish, I bet you can figure out the agenda. What's the agenda of that cartoon? Yeah? Yeah, let's end that abuse to the bulls. Let's end bullfighting. Bullfighting has been a tradition in parts of Spain. Parts of Spain hate bullfighting. So it's more in the Andalusia part of Spain, in the south and in the center part, around Seville and Granada, that they practice bullfighting, but bullfighting is not practiced in Barcelona. It's seen as cruel there. But there are parts of Spain that still practice bullfighting, but from the outside we look in and we'll say that culturally that's inhumane. But they say it's a big part of our culture. This is like someone looking into the Calgary Stampede and saying, well, you shouldn't have chuck wagon races because horses get killed almost every year. And people in that industry, in that culture, are dumbfounded by outsiders that have no connection to the sports, to the lifestyle, saying that we should change our chuck wagon part. That's really the big show, right, at the Calgary Stampede. That's their 100-meter sprint. That's the crown spectator sport to watch there. But there are lots of people that believe it shouldn't exist. Or maybe we're talking about the seal hunt. That there are many Canadians that hunt baby seals and smash them on the snow. It's cultural, or it's economic. But is it right? So bullfighting's easy for us because it's in Spain, but there's equivalents here in Alberta. What's evidence of cultural homogenization that we see in that photograph? Within that photograph, what is evidence of cultural homogenization? Yes?
They're on phones.
They're on a phone, and yeah, their phone's even better than mine, right? And that's an old picture. So yay, me. How might someone say that this is a good thing? That the phone is a vehicle for good? How would you continue that argument that cultural homogenization is good because these two have a phone, and through that phone it's a vehicle for good? How is it a vehicle for good? Yes?
You can stay up to date with the laws, so you're not, blind to what's happening.
Yeah, so the phone is so much more than a phone. In fact, most people don't really talk to anybody on it, right? But the phone is a window to the world. They can stay up to date on everything that's happening in other countries, in their country, social justice. They can be engaged in that. In fact, in Egypt, in 2012, when they had a revolution against the tyrannical government of Muammar Barak, they used social media to plan that revolution. They used their phones. They used Facebook so that they knew where to gather and when to gather. Phones and all of the apps and tools that come with cell phones is a way to mobilize the masses. It's a way to educate the masses. And that can be a positive thing. That these two girls now have choices because they have that phone. But
Next time we asked that if there was any students who did not receive their textbook last week, that you go to the book room to get your textbook program. That many students who still need to get textbooks, please go to the book room at this time. Thank you.
But continuing that logic, who might look at the photograph and say, sure, the phone is a window to the world, but it's a dangerous window, it's a bad window. So who would look at that and say, no, they shouldn't have a phone? Yes?
On like cultural reasons, they could be looking at a lot of like US and like Canadian influencers and then throw away their culture to follow.
Yeah, so their culture could be contaminated by social influencers from the West, not in a positive way. This is what alarmed Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. This is why they had their jihad, their holy war against the West, because they felt that their traditional Islamic lifestyle was being threatened. That they saw that there were people that had one foot in the American life and one foot in 7th century Islam, and you can't live in both. So if their culture is to have a future, they may have to not allow that influence, that dangerous influence of the phone. Here's a chart that says better English and income go hand in hand. So as you score higher on your understanding of the language of English, your gross national income goes up. I'm going to pause this because I don't want the first video to be 3 hours long. And I'm going to get you to try to figure out how does that source connect to cultural homogenization. Then I'll probably bring up a couple more so that you can work on them on your own. And then in about 10 minutes, we'll talk about them in the second half of this video. But so that we can split the video into two halves, and so that when we're talking about the sources, you've kind of already looked at them a little bit. I'm going to pause the video now, give you some time at your desk to look at these, try to see cultural homogenization in each one, and then we'll see if homogenization is good, or is it bad?